Hey, second grade friends, it's Mrs. Herbay. Today we are going to finish up our Gyotaku fish print lesson by creating a watery background for our fish that we created last week. I sent home a tray of watercolors for you, and I also sent you home a white crayon that is taped to the top of the watercolor box. If you have any other crayons that you may want to use, you might want to grab those. And then we're going to need two additional things. To watercolor paint, we're going to need a little cup of water. There is a brush inside your watercolor container. And then also another cool thing that we're going to use as part of this is we're going to need a little bit of salt. So I'm just taking, you can take some salt out of a salt shaker, or if your mom or dad has a container of salt, just put a little bit of salt in the container. You don't need a lot. And we're going to be using that as well. Okay, so go ahead, gather your supplies, and then we'll get started. Okay guys, so the first thing I'm going to do is gently take this crayon off the top of this box here. Just peel back the tape. Okay, and before we watercolor though, we're going to do a couple things with the crayon. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to, and I'm going to grab a couple other crayons as well. Here you have a blue-green. So we're going to be thinking about an underwater scene. And you can make yours as simple or as creative as you would like. One of the things we're going to talk about today is movement and how we can show movement in our artwork. And you can show movement by using line. And so a lot of times, I don't know if you've ever been to the ocean or a lake, but when you go under the water, you can kind of feel the waves or the water's moving, and it's moving back and forth. And how do you show that? And one of the ways we can kind of show that is by making kind of some wavy lines kind of on our paper. And the other cool thing that we're going to do is, the reason I gave you a white crayon is white. If we draw with white, we're not going to see it, but when we watercolor over it, what's going to happen is the wax in the crayon is going to repel the water and the color, and so then it's going to show up. But you may also want to draw some other lines or other details to the bottom of your watery scene. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to draw just some wavy lines, and I'm going to press. When you draw with the crayon, you want to press with a fair amount of pressure. And you might say, why? Well, if you don't have a nice solid layer of crayon on there, what's going to happen is it won't really repel the watercolor. So you won't get as good of a resist look as you might have hoped. Another thing you can do, I'm going to try this blue crayon, is you can kind of make it go like that. You can make lines like that. Also with your crayon, you can make, maybe you want to draw some little circles for little bubbles. And you can kind of, if you hold your paper, you guys will not be able to see it, but if you hold your paper at an angle, you kind of can see where you've drawn the white lines. Draw another one. You can also, let's say you want to draw some plant life, you know, that's at the bottom of the seafloor. You can draw that with your crayons as well. Oops. I was pressing so hard I broke my crayon. So you can do that. I'm going to use, so you can draw plants. You can really draw anything that you want. And Or if, let's say, you don't really want to draw much, you don't have to do that either. You can just kind of, you can do some of your lines together. You could do some of your lines apart. You can kind of mix and match kind of where you put your lines. Might do a few lines down here too. This one, let me take one more. Use my blue-green. Okay. And then once you have drawn everything that you want to draw, I might add a few more little greens here. Okay. Then once you've drawn everything you want to draw, then we're going to talk about watercolor. So I'm going to stop the video, give you a chance to kind of draw what you want to draw for your watery background with your crayons, and then we're going to start with our watercolor next. All right guys, so I'm all set up for watercolor. I've got my watercolor paints, I've got my cup of water. It's not super full, you don't need it to be super full. I've got my salt, I've got my paintbrush, and if you want, you can also have like a paper towel to sometimes dry your brush off if it gets too wet. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple watercolor techniques. One of the things you can do first is you can take your brush, okay, and you're going to paint back and forth just with the water. You're going to say, huh? But what that does is that gets the paper a little bit wet. And then what you can do is you can choose, there's a bunch of blues. There's like a light blue here. There's a deeper blue. There's a purple, and then like a blue violet color too. And so what you want to do is you want to wake up the watercolor. So you're going to kind of really give it a swish swish. And then what you can do is see how I'm painting over the area where I already wetted the paper, and you can kind of see how it's kind of spreading. And one of the things with watercolor, you just want to go back and forth. If the color is really, really light, then you want to try to get more paint on your brush and then less water. And let's say I want to mix a couple colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse my brush, and then I'm going to dip it into this deeper blue. I'm going to get a little more water going on in there. The trick with watercolor is not getting, it's sort of finding that balance of you don't want too much water, but you need enough water to get the paint so that it is flowing and spreading. So I'm going to wake this up just a little bit more, and then you can see how it's getting a little bit darker. And one of the things you can do is while your paint is still wet, this won't work when it's dry, but while your paint is still wet, so I'm going to kind of, so this area right in here is kind of wet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little bit of salt. I'm going to sprinkle it onto my paper. And then you're going to see what happens. You're going to see how the, I'll hold this up a little bit. You're going to see how the salt is starting to get a little bit darker. And what happens is the salt is picking up it's absorbing the water and also the color that you put down. And what it's going to do is it's going to leave these white little bubble kind of things. Now, once you put the salt on an area, you don't want to paint back over that area. So I'm just going to leave that alone over there. Oh, there's one of my white lines. It just came through. You can also, when you're watercoloring, let's say you want to mix, sometimes water is not always blue. It has some blue-green to it. So next to this light blue, there's sort of like a blue-green color. And I'm going back and forth. You don't want to scrub your paper, so you just want to gently go back and forth. I'm going to kind of try to get this a little bit darker for you guys so you can see. So if I don't wet the paper and I paint with the watercolor, see how much darker it is where I wet the paper down here. So if you're looking for lighter shades, then you might not want to wet the paper first. If you're looking for darker shades, you might want to wet the paper. The other cool thing is that if you add a little bit of water, you can kind of spread the paint out. But what some people like to do is they get impatient and they think, well, if I just scrub a little bit harder, paint's going to come, more paint's going to have, you know, come off the brush. And it's not. There's only so much paint on your brush, and then that's all that there is. So you want to kind of paint, and then when no more paint is coming onto the paper, that means you need to get some more paint onto your brush. So I kind of have this bottom area colored, and then I'm going to I'm just working my way up. So I'm brushing a little bit of water here. Oops, I can see there's where I drew those little circles there. You also might want to introduce a little bit of this, and you can really introduce any color, any colors that you want. So there's sort of a blue-violet. And you can kind of mix the colors. If you get the paper wet a little bit, then what can happen is you can mix the colors and they kind of will bleed into one another. I'm going to get a little more violet down here too. Another cool color that you can kind of maybe even, that even looks a little bit cool, is like putting a little bit of little streaks of that in there too. Whoops. My paper is still wet down here. I can see it. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt down in there. You're going to be able to see. So I'm going to just keep working. So here I'm going to wet this section a little bit. And I think I want to try some darker blue. And you can see when it's already wet, see how the colors kind of bleed into one another, which is kind of fun. And then I can get a little bit of darker blue and kind of put that on there. And then maybe I want a little bit more of this. If the color's not super dark, you can kind of really kind of wet it. Whoops, there we go. Now it's nice and dark. And then to spread it, I'm just going to wet my brush a little bit. And then by wetting my brush, I'm able to kind of spread the watercolor around. And I'm going to put a little bit more of the light blue on there. Some dark blue. And I might get some of my aqua. And then this area right here is kind of nice and wet. You can see once I've painted, if I take a little bit of the darker paint and then kind of paint over top, it gives you a really cool effect like that. And then I'm gonna again sprinkle a little bit of my salt in that wet area. And I'm gonna take a minute and show you guys, if you haven't noticed, see down, kind of hold this back so you can kind of see, but down in this area right here, you can see what happened to all that salt. It made this really cool, like sparkly kind of effect here. And so you kind of have to leave it on and let it dry. And you also have to make sure it's wet. Now you can see here, oops, I touched the edge of my paper, so I kind of wiped off some of that paint. So I'm just going to kind of brush that back on there. Okay. And then you're just going to continue your way up the paper. I'm going to kind of play around with, see the wet, if you do the wet, and then see how it's like, woo, you get kind of this like sort of bleeding effect, which looks kind of cool. And again, if you want it to be darker, now I'm painting right on the paper and the paper is not wet. So you can kind of see how the difference there. I'm going to paint on the paper where it's not wet here with this light blue, and you can see it's a little bit darker there. And then let's say I want to spread the colors out, then I take my wet brush and kind of spread them. And you want to wake up the green a little bit. Sometimes it takes a little bit of water to kind of get these going. You can just kind of have fun playing around with some of the different colors and overlapping. Oops, that's a chunk of watercolor. Might try a little bit of this again. And a little bit more blue. And now you can really see the white that I painted, or that I colored with my white crayon. Notice how that purple is so much darker because this area isn't dark, and see how it's not spreading very well. So that tells me my brush is saying, I'm thirsty. You don't want to have puddles of water on your paper, but if it's sort of beating up and the paint isn't spreading, that kind of tells you that you need to add a little bit more water to kind of spread it around. Okay. The other cool thing is you can go back over areas that you did paint and add a little bit more paint or color. I added a little bit, I made that a little bit wet there, so I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt. You don't want to put too much, just a little bit is good. And there you can kind of see, and then I'm working my way up to the top. Oop, there's my other line. There, because the paper's wet, my paint is bleeding. I'm going to try a little more of this purple in here. You can kind of see how it's kind of all bleeding together. And I'm almost to the top. I'm almost finished. I'm going to wet this. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of this blue-green color because I think it's really cool. And then I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt. Okay. And then what you're going to do is you're going to let this dry. If you need to smooth anything out, like let's say right here, this looks a little bit dark to me. What you can do is, again, you can take your wet brush and kind of paint over top. And it's kind of, see how it's making that a little bit lighter there. So it's blending it a little bit more. Another thing you can do is you can also take your paper towel and you can dab, and your paper towel gives an interesting texture like that too, which looks kind of cool too, which makes it look a little bit watery and mysterious as well, if you think that's kind of cool. So I hope you have fun doing this. Now, what we're going to do is once you get your whole paper watercolored, you're going to need to let it dry. And so we're going to let this dry, and then I'm going to show you what the final steps are. Okay? All right, guys. So while your watercolor painting is drying, what you can do is, if you want to grab the fish that you printed last week, and if you grab a pair of scissors, then we are going to cut out our fish, okay? And you want to be careful when you're cutting out your fish, because you don't want to cut off any important parts. So what you're going to do is you're just going to carefully cut around the outside of your fish. And if part of the, when you printed your fish, if there were parts that that bled across, or like out from the drawing, you can just cut those off. So like, see, I have some kind of in here and in here. So when I go to cut up in here, what I'm going to do is just cut that off. And I'm just carefully going around the tail. Always want to use your opposite hand that you're cutting with to kind of drive the bus for your cutting. So you're just using this to control the paper, and the other hand is just opening and closing. Okay, so I got all that, and then I'm just going to carefully go in here and in there, and there is fish number 1. And then what you guys can do is, just gonna round this a little bit. And then if you have more than one fish, go ahead and cut out those as well. All right, guys, once your paper is completely dry, and I say completely, and it may take a couple hours, what'll happen is the salt, is you're gonna see the salt has formed these really cool, like, you almost see like these little white areas. And what I would do is, I'm just gonna do this right here on my mat, but I would do this over a trash can. What you can do is you're just going to rub that salt off of your piece of paper, and it will come loose just like that, okay? And then your paper should feel completely smooth. And then what's really cool is you're left with all of these really cool, like little bubbly looking things from the salt. All right, then what you'll do is you'll take your fish, however many fish you made. The other cool thing about your fish prints is this. Let's say you have your watery background and you're like, oh, I wish I had one more fish. The great thing is you have your printing plate. You can always print another fish, and if you don't have enough paper, you can always ask me to send you some more drawing paper, but you should have had at least enough for a fish if you wanted to, okay? So then what you'll do is you'll figure out where you want your fish. You can have them kind of angled, you can have them this way. Another cool thing that we did, that I've done with kids over the years, is what they've done, and I'll do this to this one, is they've cut the fish at some point. So I'm going to cut this part right here, and you're going to go, oh, what are you doing? But what I'm doing is then you kind of get more fish. So it can look like, and this doesn't even have to necessarily be the same fish. So you can have a fish here, you can have part of a fish here, and then you can have another fish there, which is also sometimes kind of fun. So kind of figure out a layout for your fish that kind of goes with the movement of your piece of paper, or not of your piece of paper, but your watery background. And once you figure it out, then you'll just take your glue stick and you will turn your fish over. I'm going to slide this up a little bit. You're going to turn your fish over. Make sure you outline all the edges and then do the middle. And then I'm going to place this. Give it a nice rub. Okay. And then I'll do it for my second fish, where again, I'm just going to make sure I outline the edge of the fish first, get all of the little fins and whatnot, and then you can put some glue in the middle. And then I'm going to position this fish kind of right here like this. If there's a part you didn't get, you can always just give it a little swap of glue. And then my last one, turn this over, outline, and then I'm going to position this. Okay, and I am finished. So I hope you guys had a lot of fun with this, and I can't wait to see your finished fish. You can take a picture of your artwork, upload it to the assignment page, and also I'll look forward to having you guys show me your fish on Thursday. Now, for these watercolors, what I would do is after you're done painting with them, just leave the tray open for a little bit. They will dry back up. You can close them up, and then if you would kindly send the watercolor tray back to school, because I can then use these with other students as well. Okay? So have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.